Do you know why you're being stopped tonight?
No, officer. Could you explain the reason?
We received a report of a suspicious vehicle in this area.
Are we being detained or are we free to leave?
It started the way 1,000 other bad nights start, with the sudden, blinding flash of red and blue lights reflecting off a rearview mirror. And the chilling realization that doing everything right doesn't always protect you. What should have been a brief exchange of paperwork on a quiet residential street was about to unravel into a masterclass on how unchecked assumptions and fragile egos can strip away constitutional rights in a matter of seconds. The air in the car was thick with the smell of stale airport coffee and the exhausted silence that only comes after a 12-hour travel day. Marcus tapped his thumbs against the worn leather of the steering wheel. He was 34. A senior architect whose life revolved around precision, blueprints, and mitigating risks. Beside him in the passenger seat was his younger brother, David, a 31-year-old network engineer who was currently fighting a losing battle against jet lag. David had just closed on his first house, a modest mid-century ranch in a quiet, affluent suburb of Chicago. The neighborhood was everything David had worked for: manicured lawns, mature oak trees whose branches formed a canopy over the street, and a suffocating, almost eerie silence. It was past midnight on a Tuesday. The streetlights cast long, amber shadows across the pavement. Because David was exhausted from his flight, Marcus was driving David's car, a slightly battered 5-year-old Honda Civic that looked entirely out of place next to the pristine SUVs lining the driveways of Elm Creek Drive. Marcus slowed the car to a crawl, his eyes scanning the dark mailboxes, trying to make out the brass house numbers. He pulled over close to the curb, put the car in park, and left the engine idling to keep the heater running while David fumbled with his phone to double-check the newly installed lockbox code. They didn't know that 3 houses down, Mrs. Gable had been watching them through her front blinds. She didn't know Desaf. She didn't know he had just bought the house at the end of the cul-de-sac. All she saw was an unfamiliar, older car driving 10 miles an hour, lingering near driveways. She picked up her phone and dialed the non-emergency police dispatch, reporting a suspicious vehicle prowling the neighborhood. The blue and red strobe lights hit the interior of the Civic with the force of a physical blow. The silence of the car was instantly shattered by the low, oscillating chirp of a police siren. Marcus blinked, his heart rate spiking involuntarily despite his innate, methodical calmness. He looked in his mirrors. A patrol cruiser had pulled up at a slight angle behind them, its high beams illuminating the dust particles dancing in the air behind the Honda. Marcus took a slow, deep breath, resting both his hands firmly at the 10 and 2 positions on the steering wheel. He nudged David, who jolted awake, blinking against the harsh glare. Footsteps crunched heavily on the fallen autumn leaves. The ambient noise of the neighborhood, a distant dog barking, the low hum of a central air unit seemed to mute itself as the silhouette of an officer approached the driver's side window. The beam of a tactical flashlight pierced the glass, sweeping over Marcus's face, darting to David, illuminating the back seat, and finally settling right in Marcus's eyes. Marcus pressed the button to roll down the window. The crisp, biting October air rushed in, carrying the faint scent of exhaust. Officer Hayes stood just behind the B-pillar of the car, a textbook positioning meant to keep him out of the driver's immediate line of sight. Hayes was young, maybe 24, a rookie who operated strictly by the manual, his posture stiff, his jaw tight. Evening. Hayes said, his voice flat, trying to project the commanding presence that his slight frame couldn't quite support. Driver's license, registration, and proof of insurance. Marcus squinted against the blinding beam of the flashlight. Good evening. Officer, my license is in my wallet. In my back right pocket. The registration is in the glove compartment. How would you like me to proceed? It was an architect's answer, logical, precise, deferential, but to Hayes, who was riding the adrenaline of a suspicious vehicle call in the middle of the night, The overly formal response felt evasive. Just get the documents. Hayes commanded, his hand resting casually, yet purposefully, on his utility belt. Marcus moved slowly. He retrieved his wallet, handed over his ID, and then turned to David. Dave, glove box. David popped open the glove compartment, a stack of napkins, an old tire pressure gauge, and a cluster of papers spilled out. David leaned forward, sifting through the mess. His movements sluggish and uncoordinated from exhaustion, he let out a frustrated sigh, muttering under his breath about the mess to David. It was a sigh of fatigue. To Officer Hayes, observing from the dark, it was an expression of contempt. Keep your hands where I can see them. Hayes snapped, his tone suddenly dropping an octave. The tension ratcheting up instantly, the flashlight beam locked onto David's hands. David froze, a crumpled insurance card in his fingers. I'm just getting the paper. Man, David said, his voice carrying the slight edge of a man who had been traveling for 20 hours and was now being shouted at in front of his own new home. It was a minor pushback, a microscopic fracture in the absolute compliance that the situation demanded, but it was enough. The radio on Hayes' shoulder crackled. Backup had arrived. Another cruiser pulled up silently, boxing the Civic in. The heavy, rhythmic thud of a car door closing signaled the arrival of Sergeant Miller. Miller was a 20-year veteran. He had the thick build and the slow, deliberate walk of a man who believed he had seen it all and already knew how every script ended. He didn't view the streets as a community to be policed. He viewed every interaction as a potential threat matrix that needed to be aggressively managed. Miller walked up to the passenger side, his own flashlight joining Hayes's, crisscrossing the interior of the car in a disorienting, strobing effect. What do we got? Hayes Miller asked, his voice low, gravelly, and carrying an absolute assumption of authority. Suspicious vehicle call. Sarge, occupants are being a little uncooperative. Hayes replied over the roof of the car. Marcus's grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles turned white. He knew the unwritten rules of survival. In this scenario, he knew that uncooperative was a magic word, a skeleton key that unlocked a different level of police engagement. Officer, Marcus said, keeping his voice carefully modulated, stripping it of any emotion. We haven't been uncooperative. I handed you my license. My brother is handing you the insurance. We are just trying to get to his house right there. Marcus pointed a single finger toward the driveway 20 feet away. Miller leaned down, putting his face uncomfortably close to the passenger window, staring past David to look directly at Marcus. I didn't ask for a story. So, Miller said, the use of son was deliberate, a verbal power play designed to establish dominance. Step out of the vehicle. Marcus felt the air catch in his throat. The leap from asking for registration to ordering them out of the car was massive. Officer, Marcus began, his architectural mind calculating the legal boundaries he knew were suddenly being blurred. Under what legal authority are you asking me to step out of the car? Am I being detained for a traffic violation? It was a completely valid, lawful question. Under the precedent of Pennsylvania v. Mims, police officers have the right to order a driver out of a vehicle during a lawful traffic stop for officer safety. However, the initial stop itself must be supported by reasonable, articulable suspicion that a crime has occurred, is occurring, or is about to occur. A vague phone call from a neighbor about a slow-moving car does not automatically grant police the authority to conduct an investigative detention unless they observe a specific traffic violation. Marcus hadn't committed a traffic violation. He was legally parked on a public street, but in the real world, on a dark street corner at 1 a.m, constitutional case law is rarely debated on equal footing. Step out of the vehicle now, or I will remove you from the vehicle. Miller commanded, ignoring the question entirely. The subtle click of a holster retention snap echoed loudly in the quiet night. The dynamic had shifted from an inquiry to an ultimatum. The perceived disrespect of a citizen questioning police authority had triggered a deeply ingrained bias in Miller. He assumed that if they were questioning the stop, they were hiding something. Marcus looked at his brother. He saw the genuine fear creeping into David's tired eyes. "Okay," Marcus said softly, "I am stepping out. My hands are empty." He opened the door slowly and stood up into the biting cold. "You too, passenger, out of the car." Hayes ordered. David complied. Moving stiffly, "Turn around. Face away from me. Interlock your fingers behind your head." Miller barked. The officers moved in, patting them down, a Terry frisk, theoretically permitted only if the officer has a reasonable belief that the suspect is armed and dangerous. Neither Marcus nor David had done anything to suggest they were armed. They were wearing fitted t-shirts and jeans. There were no mysterious bulges, no aggressive movements, yet they were subjected to the humiliating, intrusive hands running up their legs and across their waistbands. The search yielded nothing but key fobs and cell phones. "Sit on the curb," Miller instructed as Marcus and David sat on the cold, damp concrete. The true procedural violation began to unfold. The officers had secured the scene. There was no weapon. There was no visible contraband. Violate under the Fourth Amendment. A police encounter cannot be prolonged longer than is reasonably necessary to complete the mission of the stop. Rodriguez v. United States. If the stop was for a suspicious vehicle, that suspicion should have been dispelled the moment they verified Marcus's identity and heard their explanation that David owned the house right in front of them. But Miller wasn't satisfied. His ego had been bruised by Marcus's calm. Intelligent questioning. "Smells like weed in the car." "Hayes," Miller said loudly, projecting his voice so the brothers could hear. It was a blatant, fabricated lie. The only thing the car smelled of was old coffee and synthetic pioneer freshener, but the invocation of the smell of marijuana has long been utilized as an undeniable, unprovable golden ticket to bypass the Fourth Amendment requirement for a search warrant. It establishes instant probable cause based entirely on the subjective olfactory testimony of a badge. "I smell it too, Sarge." Hayes chimed in, eager to align with his supervisor, adopting the lie as truth to justify the escalating situation. "You have got to be kidding me." David blurted out from the curb, his exhaustion finally giving way to anger. "There's no weed in there. I'm a network engineer with security clearance. I don't even smoke. I just bought that house." He pointed frantically at the structure behind them. "Shut your mouth," Miller snapped, pointing his flashlight directly at David's face, blinding him. "We'll let the search determine what's in the car." Marcus watched in quiet, simmering outrage as the two officers began to tear apart his brother's car. They pulled out the floor mats. Throwing them onto the wet grass, they emptied the center console, scattering David's receipts, charging cables, and mints across the seats. They opened the trunk, rummaging through David's meticulously packed suitcases, unzipping toiletry bags, and pulling out folded clothes, tossing them carelessly aside. It was a violation of privacy that felt violently intimate. Marcus understood the architecture of systems, and he was watching the justice system structurally fail in real time. He knew that arguing right now would only result in an arrest for obstruction or resistance. He had to sit there, shivering in the cold, swallowing his pride, and let men with badges illegally dissect their property simply because they felt like it. 20 agonizing minutes passed. The officers found absolutely nothing. No drugs, no weapons, no stolen goods. Just the mundane artifacts of two professional men living ordinary lives. Miller slammed the trunk shut, the heavy thud echoing down the quiet street. He walked over to where the brothers sat on the curb. He didn't look apologetic. He didn't look embarrassed. He looked annoyed that his intuition had failed him. Or rather, that reality had failed to conform to his bias. He tossed Marcus's license and David's insurance card onto the grass near their feet. Keep your registration current. Miller said, a meaningless piece of parting advice meant to retain a shred of authority. He didn't tell them they were free to go. He just turned his back, walked to his cruiser, and drove away. Hayes lingered for a moment, looking uncomfortably at the mess inside the Honda, before silently returning to his own car and following his supervisor. Marcus and David were left sitting on the curb of an empty, silent street. The flashing lights were gone, replaced by the mundane amber glow of the street lamp. It took them 20 minutes to repack the trunk and gather the scattered papers from the floorboards. They barely spoke. The emotional hangover of the adrenaline rush left them hollow, vibrating with an anger that had nowhere to go. When they finally walked up the driveway and unlocked the front door of David's new house, the victory of homeownership had been entirely stripped away, replaced by a lingering sense of vulnerability. But Marcus was not a man who let structural failures go unaddressed. The next morning, methodical and cold, he began the process. He filed a formal complaint with the department's Internal Affairs Division. He requested the dispatch logs, the 911 audio, and crucially, the body-worn camera footage. He also canvassed the neighborhood. It turned out the neighbor directly across the street from where they were pulled over had a high-definition security camera pointing straight at the curb. The homeowner willingly provided the footage to Marcus. The twist of the narrative didn't come from a dramatic courtroom showdown. It came 3 weeks later, sitting in the sterile, fluorescent-lit office of an internal affairs investigator. The investigator pressed play on the synced footage. The video showed everything exactly as it happened. But the audio from Officer Hayes' body cam captured something chilling that occurred before the officers approached the car for the second time. When Miller had first arrived and walked up to Hayes' cruiser, the microphones picked up their hushed conversation. Who we got? Miller's recorded voice asked, 2 guys, out-of-state plates. Driver's got an attitude. Asked why I stopped him. Hayes replied on the tape, in this neighborhood, at this hour, they're casing the place. We need to get in that car. Just say they're acting nervous. If they push back, tell me you smell weed. Copy that. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't an honest mistake driven by the stress of the job. It was a calculated, deliberate conspiracy to bypass the Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution. The smell of marijuana was a premeditated fabrication designed to manufacture probable cause where none existed, born purely out of a biased assumption that 2 men who didn't look like they belonged in that neighborhood must be criminals. The security footage from across the street also clearly captured the ambient audio of the night. There was no loud music, no erratic driving. Just a quiet car, slowly looking for an address. The fallout was not cinematic. There were no immediate handcuffs for the officers. No dramatic firings on the evening news. The justice system protects its own with layers of bureaucracy. Sergeant Miller was quietly placed on administrative leave pending a broader review of his previous traffic stops, a process that would likely drag on for months, possibly ending in an early pension-protected retirement. Officer Hayes received a formal reprimand and was sent to mandatory retraining on constitutional search and seizure, a slap on the wrist for a civil rights violation. But the reputational damage began to seep through the cracks. The footage, obtained by a local investigative reporter after Marcus filed a civil rights lawsuit, made its way online. It didn't go viral with millions of views, but it circulated heavily within the community and local political circles. It became a permanent digital stain on the department's record, a concrete example of the systemic procedural abuse that marginalized communities had been reporting for decades. Now happening on the pristine streets of Elm Creek Drive. For the police department, it was a public relations nightmare that forced the chief to implement a strict new policy requiring supervisors to articulate specific objective facts on body camera before initiating any vehicle search based on odor alone. For Marcus and David, the consequences were more personal, more invisible. David installed a state-of-the-art security system on his new house, not to protect himself from burglars, but because he no longer trusted the patrol cars that slowly cruised past his window at night. Whenever Marcus drove, he found himself compulsively checking his mirrors, his heart rate inexplicably spiking every time a car with a light bar pulled up behind him at a red light. They had won the legal battle. They had proven they were right. But the feeling of safety, the illusion that the rules apply equally to everyone, was gone forever. We like to believe that the law is a rigid, impenetrable shield, guaranteed to protect us as long as we follow the rules. Speak politely and keep our hands visible. But what happens when the people entrusted to enforce the law decide that your very presence in a space is a threat and use their authority not to protect the community, but to fabricate a reality that justifies their own prejudice? The scariest part of this story isn't that a confrontation happened. It's how easily, quietly, and procedurally the confrontation was manufactured, and how, if it weren't for a forgotten microphone and a neighbor's camera, it would have just been another undocumented night where a constitutional right vanished into the cold. Suburban air,